from the discoveries of a scientist, the inventions of an inventor, the literature, the art.
Well, you really. I don't know if you really want. I don't know. It depends. I can't. I mean, I've heard that. I've read the people's theories that some different cultures will do different things various times. And there was even there's an article on surrealism I read recently, where somebody claimed surrealism changed the nature of science in the early part of the century. And I don't know. It's very hard for me.
Changes the other.
It's very hard for me.
There's a common thing going on in the culture that you see.
I find it hard really to see that kind of connection. I would say that there are. I think the things that have far greater influence on science are the larger aspects of the culture, with how you educate people, how you allow them to make mistakes, how well you allow them to interact. What value being a creative human being, the society, the value assigns to that particular subject. I mean, until 2 weeks ago, organized greed was the paradigm. Yeah. Right. I mean, this was the, and so when one looks around, when you look around at the world. I don't think that scientists, maybe there are inspired scientists, and there probably are some people. But I suspect that scientists do most scientists work the way most other people operate, which is you work to make a living. You work in that which is the most pleasant way of occupying your time. I know in my case, I became a scientist because I didn't want to be poor anymore, and then I ultimately blundered into radio astronomy because that was the kind of job I got in graduate school, and then you're exposed to a number of things, and what happens ultimately is what you do is you look for people who appeal to you. You see people behaving. You look at in graduate school especially. You look and you see role models, and the way this person spends his or her time is a way I'd like to spend my time. So you go to this person, and you act in the same way. So it's not all that different from who was this guy in Gunsmoke? So I don't have Doc so and so, the old doctor, who the way he got to know how to take bullets out of Matt Dillon's legs was by going with some other doctor and reading medicine. Right? You look at a person, you say, "This is what you want to do," and you study with that person.
Okay, but you're saying that that's something that it depends largely on a person's experience.
It depends on a person's predilections. It depends. Well, it's two things. It's predilections. It is a person's predilections who makes choices. The thing is that if one is lucky enough to go to university, you may get a much larger range of choices, right? If you happen to be born in some country where your choices are digging the land or going, this is say, 9th century Italy, your chances, you have two choices. You can go there and dig a hole in the ground, or you can join a monastery. I mean, those are your choices. So you don't have a lot of different ranges. I mean, you're not going to go out and try to measure the velocity of light or grind a telescope to look for the moons of Jupiter. It's not an option. A person may be a perfectly good astronomer. I think really it's the option.
The question that Suzanne is asking, I think, too, though, is a question, because you keep talking about the way in which you bring experience, and you demonstrate that in your discussion all the time. Well, if your experience is something, you're talking about the specialization, but it's very clear. You're reading all kinds of things, and this is probably not something new to you now. You probably did as
well, yes, to some extent. I would say, to some extent, being successful, and also given, as I have a much more interdisciplinary job, I give myself a little bit more permission to look outside of my own narrow area.
But in the education process,
it's quite the opposite. Now, maybe the British elite universities go too far, but certainly more and more things resemble medical school in the sense that if it doesn't help you in your narrow pursuit of things, much of it, unfortunately, is left aside.
But there still remain humanities. Let's say for a science.
Well, you get, when I went to City College, I got 1 year. If you got, and I started in physics or whatever, I had to take a year of humanities and 2 years of English and so forth. You get a little bit. You get something which hopefully is enough that later on in life, when you grow up and you really want to, and you find something missing, then at least you know where to look to fill those gaps in your life. It's not that universities turn out well-rounded people, but at least what they do is they give you a yellow pages, as it were, and say there are such things. These things exist out there, like music, classical music, for example, and maybe later on you might get to like it. So that's that kind of access. But you ask yourself, what are the things that have had the young physicists who come into the door today? What are the big impacts on their life? Howdy Doody, perhaps. Captain Kangaroo.
But would that inform the way they do, as a visual model or something, and a solution to a problem?
I have no idea. I mean, if people sit passively in front of a boob tube long enough, I can't imagine they're good for anything. But one does. But yet, and in fact, I'm frightened. I am frightened, honestly frightened. Yeah. How different my approach to the world is from people who own TV sets. And I don't have one. I don't watch the news, and I just don't watch it. And there's so many things about the common culture I'm just totally isolated from. This one technology. I mean, I read newspapers, I read books, I read magazines, I listen to the radio. I mean, I keep up on things. But there's a whole culture, whole thing built up. I'm out of. But then there are the kids who at age 6 months, 3 months, put in front of this thing, and their ability to visualize, conceptualize, never has to be built up. I mean, at least when I was a kid and had to listen to the radio. I mean, when I came to America, I listened to The Shadow or The Lone Ranger and these things. They had tremendous influence on my life. I mean, I can read. I mean, I have a whole stock of total recall of most of the programs that were on the radio in those days. It must have had a tremendous effect on my psyche. I could tell you Sam Spade's license number. I mean, all these things that I just remember because it was important. So in that same way, there are all these inputs people get. I mean, they want to be strong or sexy or popular or whatever the item is, and somehow physics either gets them there or gets them the money for the next step, or whatever the item is, or selling junk bonds. It doesn't matter. We're all part. All these things matter. But are the physicists who also play the flute better physicists than the ones that don't? I mean, I've got one guy who went to clown school, and every year he has these exotic costumes. People do have other interests, and some people have no other interests. Who is better? Who is more successful? Hard for me to know.
Okay, let's look at the question of the philosophy and religion and what kind of influence they might have had on your life.
Well,
your career.
Religion had a tremendous influence on my life. Pragmatically, I was Jewish. I was kicked out of Germany, and if I'd stayed there, I would be dead. And like a whole generation of
going
physicists.
Beyond that,
I understand, but wait. But the point is, you can say that so overwhelms other kinds of things, right? I mean, after all, you shouldn't ask yourself the question of just what is it you believe. The far more important question, because the one that's operative, is why do you want to believe it? And so, when you come away in a world, you want to. I mean, I have children, so I want to believe not in a good world, at least in an improvable world. So, I mean, the act of having children to protect against the kind of madness that I experienced as a child has much more for me than occasionally going into some random church or synagogue and listening to a particularly inspiring preacher. Right? So philosophy is not something you read about. Philosophy is something which is built by experience. Now, since I personally do at the time, I mean, I have a sense of order and a desire for order in the world, and probably a desire for purpose. I want, with all the pain I've experienced and know about, I would hate for the world to be an accident. It would be too cruel a joke. So to that extent, sure. So I like the Big Bang Theory better, and there probably is something about that. And Bob Wilson and I kidded about it. Bob comes from a comfortable Baptist beginning in the South. On the other hand, he wants to get out of it, so he believes in the steady state theory. He liked the steady state theory because he felt that educated people really don't believe in God a lot. That was part of, right? Never mind the fact that my thesis advisor, who is on his worst day, if he ever had a worst day, can outthink me by miles, is a deacon in the Baptist church and never, prays every day. And he's a great physicist, one of the great physicists, if not of all time, certainly of our century. And so, you ask yourself the question then, how did these two people are presumably exposed in some way, exposed to the same liturgy, philosophy, and so forth. One had to escape it, or felt he wanted to, and because it's a more modern thing to do, and went off to Caltech and such. I don't want to denigrate Bob's belief or anyone else's, but you fall into these things, and it's not that the belief itself or that the attractiveness of the particular set of arguments is so is overwhelming. You can't separate that from life experience. Right? I mean, Christianity ultimately was a religion of losers in the Roman Empire. Right? The slaves first, and then the women. Right? The senators were. Senators, because after all, there is Mithras, the soldier's god, and you walk around with these big swords and Zeus and everything. It's a man, big, muscular guy. You whip the slaves and you beat up the women, and and carry them off as captive, right? And so forth. And you're in charge. You don't need Christianity. So it's not to say that Christianity doesn't have anything to say philosophically. Or the Christianity, in any way, I hope you don't think I'm disparaging it in any way. But I'm pointing out that the willingness to accept something, I mean, if you look at the two religions, you look at the religion of, look at Christianity versus Mithras, it's impossible an intelligent person could pick the other. Could pick the second one. I mean, just, it's this weird thing, so whatever. But
last shall be first.
But the point is, then there's a lot more there. There's a lot more talking about love and a lot of other stuff, which is very important. But it didn't. But remember, Christianity in the beginning didn't just win on its intellectual merits. Right? There was all this emotional, the willingness to believe. There were politics, right? All sorts of things happened, and so sure, it's better to be right, and it's better to be open, and it's better to be right. It's better to be valid. And ultimately, you respond to the more basic human needs, the long-term human need. The long-term human need, which is to find order and purpose in the world, to be able to love and live with somebody else. But that's the basic human need, but you can't forget the short-term human need. Right? And the short-term human need is to feel comfortable in my church and go there and think of myself as a good person. And so you think of the 1840s, when certain churches decided the Bible says slavery is okay, right? Because you want to be a good person. And then next door are the abolitionist preachers who say this is an evil thing, right? They're reading the same Bible. But it's what people want to believe. It's what people want to believe at the time. So in the same way, I don't think it's somebody's argument. Well, you can't separate it from life experience. That's what I'm saying. I don't think it's religion or philosophy.
In Edison's time, at the turn of the century, one can't help but notice tracing a radical change in worldview and a great turning away from religion at that time and having an old philosophy replaced with a new one at the turn of the century. And some were wondering whether have you ever thought about what effect that might have had on his life or his creativity or...
Well, the radical... That is, what happens?
Take time. You can think about that question for a moment.
Okay.
What are we on? Are we on what tape?
But one of the nice things about winning a Nobel Prize is that things which you can't get away with otherwise. We're talking about this different behavior.
Oh,
yes.
Right?
Yes. You
can freedom.
You get freedom, yes. And the point is, one of the things is you get a little bit more. It's okay. You get freedom.
Well, Thomas Edison had that too. I mean, that was exactly. I mean, he didn't get the Nobel Prize, but he reached a point at which. At which point
he ultimately strained toward freedom, and he and his friend Ford both figured, since they were successful in the things that they knew how to do, they figured that success gave them a a license to go into other fields. Well, yes, and there's some of that. That's in those cases, it may or may not have been corrupting, and I suppose in my case, a little bit corrupting too, because no matter what I say, people are willing to listen. So I don't get as much feedback about my mistakes as I would like sometimes. So you have to be a little careful.
But I would like.
But you want to talk? Let's get back to your question.
Yeah, I really want to get back to the way in which you see that shaping and influencing your.
No, we
you want to talk about? You want to talk about
Edison? Okay.
Saying that is there more innovation at times of chaos? Is that an interesting question?
Yes.
Well, I think the place to really look is that the answer to that probably has to be, to some extent, probably has to be yes. And my best example has nothing to do with Edison. My best example has to do with the French Revolution. Does anybody? Who invented photography? Niepce, right? French. The French invented the hot air balloon. They invented flight, pencils, chemistry. You start listening. One of the things that we have in America at one time. Occasionally, there are these Reader's Digest or something articles about these stupid French, who don't understand that everything was invented by the English-speaking peoples, right? And basically, of course, nobody bothers looking back, but in fact, that many of the things that we think of as coming out of 19th century Britain were French inventions a little bit earlier. But there was tremendous in both France and England at the turn of the century during this period when the French Revolution was brewing, when England was in a great state of turmoil. They were just about to lose their colonies. There were the various wars. The 30 Years' War. What was the war in the 18th century? War, I don't remember. It's 30 years, 4 years. 30. Got the right number. The 30 Years' War. All these bloody things are going on all over the world, and really the 18th century set the stage for the 19th. And the 18th century, everything we ever needed essentially was invented. 19th century, we exploited it, and then then got electronics, computers, and so forth. But computers, the first computers were already out in the 18th century. People had figured out the Leibniz and some of these other folks. It's all stuff. It's all 18th century stuff. Who was Pascal? We started looking at these people. So there's a lot of periods of upheaval seem to generate creativity. Edison came.
The Civil War is the era in which Edison, essentially became a young man.
And then you get the American frontier and all the things. But then, of course, before that, you get the Connecticut Yankees and mass production and all the stuff that was done in the East. I think what happened really, though, in Edison was a unique person. But if I look at creativity, if you look at the patents, this flow of invention in America came about because people had time and resources to invent. I'm not sure. There are some people who did more than others, and Edison, to some extent, did it because he managed to organize it. And the thing, Edison's big invention really was the research lab, the R&D lab. That was his big invention. Got a whole bunch of people working for him to help him invent. And so that, I think, the point is, if anybody in the world, there may be people who've had two great ideas, but there's so few who have one great idea that we don't worry about that. But basically, Edison had one really great idea, which was get a lot of people to help him to invent stuff. And that dramatically changed the nature of the world. So it was not so much that he invented whatever he invented R&D. That before that, people would invent one thing. Eli Whitney or who was the guy, the harvester guy? Each one of these guys, McCormick, every one of these guys would invent one thing and then go off and live off it. And Edison didn't go off and live off the stock ticker. He went off, he took his money, and he decided he'd like to become an inventor, so he invented the idea of inventing. So there are other people, Alexander Graham Bell was another one of about the same period, who just invented a whole bunch of things. People liked. One of the things that happened, of course, was that at that period in time, a tremendous infrastructure existed. The 19th century brought about machine tools. You could just make things. You could buy screws. I mean, when Pascal made his machine, he had to also make his own screws, or somebody had to make screws for him. And you look at these things, they barely work because of the problems. By the time you get to the 19th century, interchangeable parts exist. So to some extent, the upheaval may also have. It may be that it isn't the coincidence between upheaval and invention may have to do to some extent. May have to do some extent to the fact that there's a common cause for both of them, some economic change. But on the other hand, if you look at upheaved people, stirred up people, seem to do better. I mean, we talked earlier about the Jewish refugees coming to the United States. I mean, one of the things, and I hope you don't put this in the film, but I will tell you anyway. I think one of the things that I find most amazing about Israelis is how dumb they are. If you look at Israelis, you say they're Jews. Well, wow, they must have all these Nobel Prize winners. But there's not within a factor of 10 are there as many good scientists in Israel as there are in Brooklyn. Remember, one group is refugees, and this other group, they have criminals and prostitutes and petty officials and all the rest. They built themselves a country. Now they're like everybody else. Sure, the immigrants that came in did some wonderful things, but people live there just like it becomes another country. It's that wave. It's the first wave of Asian immigrants in this country now. You start looking at their children and grandchildren by the time you get down to third, fourth generation, like everybody else. But it's the first wave. And you look at, there's the story.
So there's a sense of social outcast.
That is the business of the social loner. In any field. In any field. I think one of the ingredients which for some people in creativity is loneliness. I think myself, as somebody asked a friend of mine whether I'm a lonely person, I think the answer is yes. And now, is it possible to be creative and happy? I hope so. Because I would hate to say that the kind of pain, and I have to be personal, and Jews they don't have a monopoly on pain in the world, but the pain I experienced personally. If I look at that, saying the pain it took, incredible torture, just so we could get 13 or whatever it is, 18% of all Nobel Prize winners. It's 20, 30 times, 50 times our percentage in population. Big deal. Is it really worth it? There should be some way other than pain, right? We should be able to get this kind of stuff out in other ways. If you look at creativity, you look at Edison. I mean, Edison, a life of poverty, beaten up and so forth, various things happened to him at various stages of his life. Well, other people, Alexander Graham Bell had a pretty good life. Lavoisier had a wonderful life. Pascal had a reason. A lot of the French aristocrats who did a lot of this work had very nice lives. So it isn't that all creative people have to go this route. But when we talk about the big surge, usually it seems to happen, a wave of immigrants go from one place to another place, and they become uncomfortable. And somehow you become different, and all of a sudden you have to do something where you can't just go into your father. I didn't have a father's business. If I'd been in Germany, I might have gone into my father's leather business. Right?
So there's a certain kind of drive.
So there is partly as a drive, and partly as opportunity, because it's also because the original opportunities aren't there. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised. We don't have as many good engineers as we used to, because we offer these people the opportunity to go up there and trade options or futures or something.
Isn't it if you're not that constrained by the present culture, whether it's watching TV and having your imagination clouded, you're sort of footloose, not necessarily fancy free. Does not encourage the imagination? Yeah, but in some ways it certainly does. If you're out of a culture, it can encourage you, but it may encourage in different ways. I mean, the most displaced groups have the best comedians. Because what is a comedian? Is someone who looks at the group from the outside. Right? And we're even finally beginning to get women comedians. Right? Because people are actually beginning to be willing occasionally to look at someone who can actually begin from a woman's eyes to look at the world and actually hold a mirror up to this world where half the world is in a very unpleasant situation in many ways. I want to get off the subject. I don't want to get deeply, but basically we say that we have groups who can, because you bring in a different perspective, you can find out things. It may help your imagination if you're hungry, if you can't go to college, and then it doesn't help.
it depends where it's channeled, but it certainly is an opportunity.
You're speaking a lot of this in a kind of sociological way.
But I think that's really the base.
But do you think there is a way in which being, in some sense, in a different society, in a different culture, something like that, there's obvious differences between these two, that you're able to bring a kind of different kind of matching. It's more than just opportunity.
Well, I think I will say something. There is something else that happens in a general way. Well, I think one thing that does happen, and I think the simple that goes back to the something which is that with a wave of immigration from Europe, really improved science in the United States after World War II, unquestionably. But the point was, it didn't just improve because of the scientists that came in. The other scientists did better also. Because what happens is, Art Buchwald once said that why ever have a war? Because all wars are unnecessary. You can find out on day one who's going to win. You just look at the two sides. The side with the better-looking uniforms always loses. And as far as I can tell, there are no exceptions. No exceptions to that rule I've ever been able to find. And ultimately, the only thing that looks worse than GI fatigues are black pajamas. But I mean, if you...
Where does this get us with the wave of immigration?
Because in fact, Buchwald asked a question is, why do you put people in uniforms that look alike? When people look alike, what do? They act alike. But then they also start thinking alike. When they start thinking alike, all but one of the brains becomes unnecessary. I mean, if you get a boardroom full of people if you get a list of board of directors whose names read like the male half of the Mayflower passenger list, the chances of one of those people ever speaking up, minute. Okay.
Well, to relate back to Edison, most of the recruits were from
immigrants.
Europe.
Yeah, they were immigrants.
Well, partly, I think he may have gotten
part of them.
But do you think there is a kind of conceptual cross-fertilization?
I think. Well, the point is, I think it's large. I think the simple biggest thing is when it breaks up group. The biggest single contribution, and maybe the second order things, the biggest single thing is to break up group behavior. Allow people to explore. Allow people to say it's okay to do something different. It's actually okay to raise your hand in a meeting. You don't have to keep your hands totally on a chair. You don't have to be that cool. You behave in different ways. Okay? So all the tokenism on boards of directors and the corporations and so forth turns out to be a wonderful thing. Whether the people who come are better, and they probably get on these boards, you have to be better than average anyway. But even if they weren't, just breaking the group up in some way. Being able to break things up, the staggering uniformity you find, even in Bell Labs, that breaking up, that texture, I think makes a tremendous difference. You look at Bell Labs, the president. I mean, it's one of the funniest statements. And I thought this guy. All of a sudden, I thought the president's sitting next to me, and I thought he'd made a racist remark. He's sitting in this room. We're sitting in this room, and we're visiting the Japanese. The Japanese on one side of the table, and Ian and I are sitting on the other side. And the first Japanese gets up and gives a talk. And then Ian goes over and gives a talk. And then the vice president of their research organization says something. And I get up and say something. And then their guy goes up. And we've been doing this for about 3 hours. And finally Ian pokes me in the ribs and says, well, I'm glad we finally showed them a real red-blooded American. Wake up. And then I realized what he'd said. And I said, oh my God, what are you doing? And then I realized, he was born in Europe. I was born in Europe. Kumar Patel was born in India. Right? Next guy was Chinese. And number 5 would finally been born in the United States. Right? He was talking about himself too. I said, come on. What's going on? And the point was, we look through this place. You look at that. And the point is the diversity. It's not necessarily people from other countries are smarter, but that texture, that breaking of texture, is a tremendous advantage.
Well, it could be why this country's been at the leadership of.
Well, a large part of it has to do with diversity. I think diversity is very, very important. It's painful. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things, in fact, this is the thing I keep saying about the Japanese, and the Japanese themselves recognize it, which is that their very unanimity, the ease with which they come to decisions, which is they only hire majority males of the same age group and social background for jobs, and then everybody's surprised that they agreed. They actually went far enough that in the 5th generation project, they actually went out and got a Korean minority. And, and to see, I mean, a Korean, to us, to try to find out what a Korean is, much harder than trying to go to Northern Ireland, try to, meet somebody in a pub, and without talking politics, figure out if they're Catholic or Protestant. I mean, that level, it's about at that level of difficulty to find out how you can tell if somebody is a Korean, except unless you know their name. And some of them have changed their names, whether somebody's a Korean minority in Japan or not. Women you can tell instantly, but and of course the few women engineers they have all eat with the secretaries. But the question is, that unanimity gives them a problem in creativity. I said that to Germans one time. Germans asked me about this, how come we aren't doing better in science or whatever, and I said, look, it's very simple. You have to somehow break up your group, and the best thing they can do in Germany is bring in more women scientists. And some of the French do much better than they do. But is that kind of thing. So basically, I come back not so much to what a particular culture brings to somebody, but I think the social forces are so much larger, and that when you bring people in and they are poor, and they can go to school, but they don't have the right handshake, and they don't know how to dress, and they don't belong to the right clubs, and they're going to deal with all this bigotry, may as well go into science and engineering. But then the next generation, after all, why bother? Go out there and then spend your weekend and then go out and make money.
Engineering has been a principal mode of social mobility for
some people. Yeah. For some groups of people have found engineering to be a social shortcut. Other groups have gone other directions. The Irish especially have taken into things like law and civil service and banking and various other ways. Not a lot of Irish engineers, for example. Irish have moved up socially also in this country.
I have another.
But that's just an interesting. If you go in this place, you will find many more Irish accountants, say, than you would find. Irish. They're not say there aren't some. They're not say there aren't some, but disproportionately in population, not as large in one field as another. And it's not because the Irish culture. I don't think Irish culture is such. It may just be that Fordham University's got a good law school, and they never got around to building a physics department. It can be an accident, but then there's a whole bunch of role models, and it keeps going after that. Right? I mean, it's not saying being right.
There's a momentum.
But something happens, but you look at these things, people don't all use the same pattern. Right?
Yeah. It's part two of that other earlier question about, in Edison's era, the philosophy that, I feel like the philosophy that propelled him forward to constantly keep trying new things was a real belief in progress. If there was a philosophy and a...
Yes.
And then he went crash into the next century where progress was being questioned as something that everybody believed in.
It's interesting.
He had to live through that. It's part of the drama of his story.
I think that's interesting. I think I think that's right. Yes, there have been periods when I think one of the things that's needed, that is needed to make progress is a belief in progress, or a belief that progress is possible or desirable. Now there are always people on the outside who might very well progress just because they have to, right? Nobody. If you decided, somebody, Michelangelo, whoever, didn't ask anybody who was painting a good idea. He just had to. He got a piece of clay one day. He wanted to make something out of it. He just had to. But for most people, but the more general idea to be successful, you do have to have some expectation of success. And I can understand that in the 19th century, especially with this idea of the frontier and everything, bigger is better and bigger, more opportunity. There are times when the culture goes against it. Like in the late 50s, progress here was a wonderful thing. Opposition to fluoridation was a paranoid view of the right. When Reagan first got into politics, those were the people who were anti-fluoridation. Because somehow, I suppose because the government, the powers that be, were in control of the opposition, and so you opposed fluoridation partly because it was a liberal plot. And now, of course, then during the counterculture, fluoridation was on the other side. So you get outside forces. I think But I wonder what. But could you tell me some more, since you're going to talk while this is going on? Could you tell me more about what you have in mind? I'd like you to talk.
Century, people started really worrying about it, and some of it was politically motivated because the working class and the ideas of Marx said, now wait a minute. But some of it was also philosophically motivated.
On the other hand, Marx was not really anti-growth. If you read the beginnings of,
that's right.
Of his,
but some of his followers in the next century.
Yeah, well, of course, then Marx also himself. One of the things Marx always said at least on one occasion, at least the lecture said, he says, "I'm not a Marxist. I'm Marx, but I'm not a Marxist."
There's a lot of people that fit into that category of the name that carries.
But before we even get to that, if we imagine, if you imagine Edison as one of the things about the culture, the whole culture that propelled him, and you can see it in his work, and you can see it in the arts, and you can see the earlier part of his career.
Bigger is better, more, and there are no horizons, no limits.
Well, one of the things that we've.
But did he run into limits? Did he run into limits, or he just got middle-aged?
Well, one of the questions. I mean, we've touched on this in some other ways, and I think it's also tied. It goes beyond the progress question. I don't know. Are you on the camera? It's a question of space and time, and the space and time conceptions of the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century changed very dramatically. I mean, the introduction of the electric telegraph, for example, that comes in the 1840s, dramatically changes communication. I don't have to tell you about that. And it changes both the experience of space and time and the relationship of those. And you see Edison working with telegraphy, in which he's trying, and he's not alone in this. There are other people that are working in this as well, that are trying to send more than one message, multiplexing on wire and things. So you have a different kind of sense of kind of simultaneity, a kind of compacting of time and space that is occurring because of if you will, a kind of electrical revolution that is occurring, let's say, in the second half of the 19th century. And there's and what you see Edison doing. This is question number 5. What you see Edison doing is working first out of telegraphy, which is working very specifically with this kind of space-time relationship. Then you see him, he does work in the telephone. Then he moves to the phonograph. And the phonograph is a means, like the photograph, of being able to store and retrieve information, which again is working with the space-time relationship. And the motion picture is a further continuation of that, now with it having both the image, the photograph, if you will, and motion, and the storage and retrieval kind of process, which is, there's a dramatic way in which is the theme running through his work that has to do with this kind of manipulation.
Well, but he also invented a lot of, I think probably the two much bigger motives in his life were curiosity and profit.
Right, but there's
I
suspect you're quite right. But you see, the question is, as you started out this interview, there's, the world is wide open to all kinds of possibilities. And why is it that there seems to be? Sure, he's pursuing that, and that's a part of a.
No, but why are there open possibilities? The problem is it gets harder. But if we look at Edison's life, and you look toward the end of Edison's life, all of a sudden you find the discovery of the electron. You start beginning to know more stuff. And you find all of a sudden that whereas Edison could take on the whole world originally, now you find people like Steinmetz, you find Westinghouse, you find people who are all of a sudden learning about things, a narrower focus, right? And you have Edison versus Westinghouse on AC versus DC. And you begin to start issues, and all of a sudden a technological infrastructure builds. It's one thing to invent electric light, and then Edison went on and tried to put in generators and start wiring cities, right? I mean, following both curiosity but profit also. The idea of gaining power, gaining strength, and so forth, making money was certainly something he was very much interested in. Right? He viewed the great train robbery as a money-making venture. Right, not as so he wasn't going to bring it to Cannes to try to get a prize, right? But the point is, the other people, the people he now started competing against, began to bring more expertise to bear in a narrow area, and so things like the early telephone repeaters, the idea of the loading coil, whole bunch of stuff, and people starting to use mathematics. Edison didn't know much about mathematics. Right. And all of a sudden, other people start bringing information in here, telephony, where more had to be known. And I'm not sure that the trust busters discouraged Edison all that much. He was still making a lot of money. And in fact, businesses were still growing. I mean, in that particular climate where you claim everybody was questioning, a kid named Henry Ford decided with $100,000 and a couple of people to go into the automobile business. Right? So there's a lot of starts. There was a lot of businesses were started in those days. There was still a lot of imperialist adventures. Sure, the Great War finally cut it down, but you got to remember the 20th century started with the Diamond Jubilee. You know, the British Empire. The British Empire went on for another. It was only in 1967 that the British Empire finally decided they couldn't afford to force East invasion. Right. So the imperialism, the growth, the sky's the limit. I mean, when did they bust up this $100 billion corporation of ours? Only a few years ago. So there was still a lot of growth. But I think the other element in the 20th century was the difference was that in the 19th century, the thing that changes the 19th century, the 20th century, is the disappearance of the frontier. And there's this physical frontier, right? There's no more land. The Hawaiian Islands were discovered. There was nothing left. Maybe the inside of Antarctica had yet to be conquered. I mean, that's why people started going to the poles. There was no place. There's no other way of joining the Explorers Club, right? There's nothing left except walking across the ice. So these were the last remnants of unknown land. So that horizon, that idea that you could just go out in the middle of nowhere and open up a farm, you didn't have to go in and file a claim and go to the water company and get yourself hooked up and then get a building permit so you could put in a septic tank and that kind of stuff. Do whatever you wanted. But in the same way, in technology, in science, innovation, the same thing happened. You no longer could go out there and invent. The reason you couldn't go out there and invent because a lot of stuff was already invented or people knew how to do it and would do it better. You couldn't invent successfully. You couldn't go out in the 20th century and invent a light bulb against somebody like Westinghouse because those people understood the idea of adsorbed gases. They understood all sorts of stuff, vacuum techniques. The glass to metal, the metal seal, the screw base, the base, the Edison socket. You know,
let's get back to the accumulation of knowledge.
Knowledge, and people have to understand. You have the screw base, and they have 7 different kinds of glass. You have to layer on one after another. Because all the metallurgy starts becoming important. People start knowing stuff. And so you don't go out and invent against those. You couldn't do what he did before. I think one of the things that happened to him was he started running up against this. And now you had to do something else. The same thing in the United States. That's not to say the disappearance of the frontier stopped progress. But what had happened, right? What happened as soon as the frontier stopped? We started building upward. You stop, there's no more open land, right? You go up. You build bigger cities, right?
When we start exploring,
you consolidate.
When we explore, we start exploring space. When we
and in the same way as technology goes, well, now to get into an area, you have to start concentrating, start building skyscrapers instead of just putting in something like the King Ranch, and so you build upward. So in that same way, I think the real change in Edison's life and toward the end of his life was that the simple life he knew in the 19th century didn't work in the 20th. And his lack of schooling, his lack of training, meant that the Edisonian approach was running out of steam. A lot of people ran out of steam. Einstein ran out of steam. Einstein's approach to science was limited to a certain period of time, and he couldn't carry it on. Some people manage for a very long time, and that an approach will work throughout their lifetime, but not everybody's does. So I don't think in Edison's case as much this politics as the reaction to the frontier. I mean, the muckrakers and this idea of why after all is it so important to get away? Why is it important to begin to control big business in the 20th century? It seems to me the simple reason is you can no longer get away from it. In the 19th century, it didn't matter. You don't like the way things are done here, you move someplace else. But all of a sudden, now the railroads go from one end of the country to another. And there's one oil company and it controls everything, and everything is sort of all held down And there's no place left to go. And now there's no place left to go. Then you got to turn around and fight. So I think the politics that you're talking about is also part of the same thing. The 19th century was the century. The difference between the 19th and 20th century is the closing of that frontier. Now we got a new frontier, the information. In fact, now, maybe in the 21st century, we're going to talk all about information. We'll go moving off in a totally different direction, as we pretty much have controlled most of physical objects, and most of the things we do nowadays is swap knowledge, which is a whole other story, but that's not about your film.
Still like to come back. I mean, I still like to come back to the question. I mean, over time, there's accumulation of knowledge, and that's one thing. But in the creative process, there's also the models and the analogies that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
And those are different in different times. I mean, the same analogies don't necessarily, the same models and images are not there from one era to another. There's models and images that are common in one era.
Sure.
That I mean,
I can tell you about bad ones.
No, go ahead.
Okay. One thing people do with analogy, which is when we try to understand nature, if science understands nature, much of what we do is we take our most recent example of high technology and we assign it to nature. So if you go in the Middle Ages, the smelting of metal, you look at the anatomy books and they have a furnace with little devils, cup it down, and the lungs are fans and the heart's a furnace. And you can have all sorts of examples. Electricity in the early 20th century. Electricity is the source of life, right? The Frankenstein monster is turned into wolf man with the lightning kind of stuff. And more recently, you have the computer as a model for the human brain. So we use analogies. I think that the point is analogies are an imperfect tool, but it's the only tool we have. So that is, and people use different analogies at different times. The miracle is that they all work.
What do you think of the dominant analogies of the second half of the 19th century?
Well, one of the dominant analogies, and the very poor one, is the equation of the brain and the computer.
I mean in the 19th century.
The 19th century.
The Edison era.
I think there was something. There was a tremendous preoccupation with electricity, right? Electricity and life, so that. Electricity somehow seemed to hold the key to everything. And there were doctors who would go around and they had these shock chairs, right? And ultimately, it goes back to the Frankenstein Wolfman and the big knife switches and the monster either being killed or brought to life by a lightning bolt. So I think the dominant, that in some sense, in the latter part of the 19th century, that was the case. Early 19th century, it was more hydraulics. Was sort of the paradigm. Was kind of the paradigm of nature and life
for power.
For power, the big difference between the 18th and 19th century was the difference was the control of energy. As we move into the 19th century, people could in fact make use of thermodynamics. That's why Kelvin was the great hero of the 19th century Britain. Who actually put a scientific stamp on all that stuff. So the big idea then was you control energy and you could do all sorts of things with it, including making cheap iron, which fed on itself, a Bessemer process. And so that moved ahead, and people's thinking revolved in those ways. Earlier on, you go back earlier, of course, the invention of clocks and the clockwork universe, and Hobbes' physics of politics, and a whole bunch of things in a very nice, orderly, sort of geared world. So I can see a technological paradigm that keeps changing. And today, the paradigm is clearly the computer. And as it was earlier, electricity and energy and whatever. And you can even go back to biblical times and think that clay was high technology at one time, or Babylonia. So you shouldn't be surprised Adam was made out of clay. And if you look at the Mayans, you find, on the other hand, that the first people were made out of carvings. Kind of interesting. People take the technology of their time as a paradigm. There was a time being an engineer was a big deal. I mean, right? That was the thing they said about Herbert Hoover. Vote for Herbert Hoover, the great engineer. I mean, there was a guy who went out building dams. I mean, the ability to apply knowledge was still I think the thing was that as the 20th century began...
And it became the social engineer. I mean,
yes, the thing was, the big thing that happened as we moved into the 20th century, as people began to get knowledge, people began to accumulate knowledge, the application of that knowledge became almost the task of the early 20th century, was the application of knowledge for human need. And that would be the first half of the 20th century, better things for better living through chemistry. I mean, his whole idea was, and the engineer, you build a dam, you harness the water, you do all these things. You put bridges across ravines and steamships across the Atlantic and all those things. So that was the paradigm of the time.
You said earlier that you think the greatest thing that Edison did, his most original thing, was
not the most original thing, the most far-reaching thing.
It was the development of a research laboratory where he had lots of people to help in the inventive process. Where do you think that came from? That kind of creative idea. What would you attribute? I mean, there's a mark of creativity.
It's a question. Well, how did he have an idea? I have no idea. I mean, I don't know why I have ideas. I don't know. I mean, just as you don't. I mean, you have no idea what the third word you're going to say is until you need it, right? I mean, we don't have.
If I'm an actor, I might, but
right? But there are things which are still beyond their knowledge. Mm-hmm. But I think for us to speculate, probably he was used to working in teams, and it was a period when he probably was nothing more than he had a flunky, and it worked out well. He had a good experience with his first 2 or 3 helpers, so he kept adding them. I don't know. He'd had a lot of money and decided to spend it on that. One doesn't know. I mean, why did Lord Rosse decide to build the largest telescope in the world on his estate? Right? I mean, did his mother sing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" to him? How do we know? I mean, it seems to me, I would say the opposite. I give you, and let me stop with that. Okay. Biologists claim that if you take any one cell, all the different patterns for the whole body are in it. It's not that nature says, make a nose here. It says, don't make anything but a nose. In other words, don't make an eye, don't make a tooth, don't make lips, don't make arms, fingernails, nothing else. Just make that one thing. It only allows that one thing to be activated and holds the others back. I think the more interesting question is not why are some people creative, but why is everybody else not creative? What is it in life that turns off that creative spark in so many ways? Because when it comes up, when people have been held down, oppressed in one place and moved to another, all of a sudden it flourishes. And then, somebody beats it back down again because of the need to make a living or defend the country or whatever the item is, or ego involvement. Huh? Mm-hmm.
But here, I mean, I want to try out something a little different in this tack, and that is what we've been talking about is creativity largely pointed to individuals. I mean, yourself as an example. I mean, Edison and many other names have passed you. What would you think? I mean, I heard you speak about Wilson. I heard you talk about the person that you went and talked to before and got the idea, the possibility of the background radiation. What would you think about the idea that there may be very creative people, but that in fact the creative process is a social process? That it really involves many different people, and that we may, as a culture, in fact, place great premium on identifying single individuals, but that might be a cultural bias.
Could be. It could be. I somewhat doubt it. I do find, objectively, some people are far more creative than others. I think the thing the culture does is either nourishes creativity through the kinds of family, if more than anything else, through the family interactions and other experiences that go into people. I don't think that things are invented by large committees. I mean, sure, the Declaration of Independence was written by a committee, but Thomas Jefferson was on the committee. So I think that there is a need for people to exchange information, but it's very, very hard. But I don't think groups of people normally have ideas as much as one person does. We share ideas and we build on each other's ideas,
Yeah,
but
well,
I don't
what
think
I
it's
mean
a substitute.
Social process. That's what I mean. I don't.
But I think that you do build a climate in which innovation can flourish, and especially as things get more complex, different people have to contribute. But just let's put 14 people in a room together and get their heads together and see if we can solve the problem. Doesn't, as far as I see, mesh with the world.
On the other hand, you have a library here at Bell Labs, and there's access to work.
Well, you need access. You need access. You certainly, the point is, the place from which you begin to be creative. The basic things you need. In fact, I once said that to my thesis advisor, something about I get my best ideas in the middle of the night. And he says, well, that's fine. He says, but that means you ought to study during the day to give you some kind of basis for this inspiration.
Do you think that? I mean, do you see your own creativity in terms of inspiration?
There is inspiration, but the inspiration is really incubating ideas. But among the ideas, you have to know what's possible and what has been done already. I mean, there's no point in it. And when's the last time you went to a doctor and so this poor guy's listening like this, and somebody says, I know what this guy needs is an electronic amplifier. And companies have actually gone into business to put amplifiers in stethoscopes, not realizing that it's a non-problem. Because you don't understand really what the doctor does, and the extra and volume has nothing to do with the problem at all. So basically, you can spend a lot of time inventing electronic stethoscopes if you don't know what's needed or what's been done.
Yeah, well, that's the difference between invention and innovation. I mean, you can invent lots of things, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily something that the market.
And so, but the point is, innovation requires both experience plus invention. You need both, and so the experience component is important.
Well,
I think we.
I just heard a little beep. Maybe that means we're done.